This week on Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, Jefferson on America at 250. Guest host David Horton informs Mr. Jefferson that the United States is now about 250 years old and that we still say we revere the Founding Fathers. Horton asked Jefferson to explain his vision of America, to assess its successes and failures in his own time, and then to observe and reflect on the United States today using his own accustomed metrics for judging the national experiment. Aside from the ruinous and swelling national debt, Jefferson seemed most concerned by the breakdown of the checks and balances doctrine that is vital to the survival of a republic. Mr. Jefferson affirmed that July 4th, 1776 is one of the most important dates in human history, possibly the most important date in the history of liberty. He was quick to add, however, that he did not mean to call attention to himself in invoking the 4th of July. All of that and more on this week's Listening to America.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton. I have the honor of serving as your guest co-host today from Radford University here in Southwest Virginia, Radford, Virginia. And Listening to America, wonderful show, absolutely fantastic with diverse topics across our nation. But even though the Thomas Jefferson Hour really doesn't exist in the way that it did for many, many years, listeners have been clamoring for more conversations with Mr. Jefferson. So today, we are here to help you in that respect. We have with us the third President of the United States. And welcome, Mr. President. We are going to enjoy a lovely conversation with you.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
You know, we are very near the 250th birthday of the United States of America. July 4th, 2026 will mark 250 years of this great American experience, measured from the date of the document you drafted, the Declaration of Independence, the signing of that document back in 1776. Mr. President, I was hoping that in this edition of Listening to America, we could discuss measurement of success of the American experiment, where we are, where we're going, and where we could be. Would you be so amenable to participate in that with us?
I would, of course, but let me start by saying I'm a little bit surprised that you date the country from July 4th, 1776. Of course, that pleases me in a certain way because I'm the author of the Declaration of Independence. But, you know, we would have been independent with or without the declaration that I wrote in the late spring of 1776. An island can't control a continent. The supply lines for Britain were simply too long. We had habits of self-government that dated back to the Mayflower Compact. Now, Britain had paid so little attention to us that we were forced essentially to govern ourselves and to invent our own social compacts. And so I came in fairly late in the game. I had a reputation for being a good prose stylist and a student of the history of ideas and the history of liberty. And so I get a lot of credit for all of that. And I do believe that in the history of the world, the pivotal date will be July 4, 1776. Why? Because for the first time, people came together to craft their own system based on consent and ratification, believing in the rights of man, believing in the indefinite perfectibility of man, believing that humans are up to the challenge of governing themselves, believing that government is at best a necessary nuisance and at worst tyranny. This is an inflection point in the history of civilization, and we Americans should be rightly proud of the thing that we accomplished in the 1770s, and July 4th seems as good a date as one could name. I should say, however, that as you probably know, John Adams wrote a letter to his beloved wife, Abigail, saying, July 2nd will be the great day. We'll have parades, we'll have fireworks, there'll be pompous speeches, there will be all sorts of celebrations, bands will play. So he effectively anticipated what July 4th celebrations are, but he thought it was July 2nd because that's the day that the Congress of the United States, the Continental Congress, actually voted independence. It wasn't until 2 days later that my document was approved by the Congress. So in a sense, he was right, but he was also wrong, as he usually was. So close. And so it's a bit of a joke, but it's not fair because he was right. It was the vote in Congress that was the important thing.
It was, but also it shows the power of the document and the icon that it was and that you were in delivering that inspired a nation. That, without that document, without those words, without that importance to the folks who were trying to form this new nation, we might not have had the fortitude to make it through the battle. I mean, you're right in that we likely would have been independent in some way, but would it have come together in the system that we're looking at, in a representative republic, in a nation of laws and a nation of thought, as opposed to a nation of servitude or a nation of lords and kings or things along that line? It's hard to know, because there was a real battle, of course, as you know, Mr. President, during your time over exactly what the makeup of our government should look like.
Well, let me say this, and as you know, I'm characteristically diffident about my own place in history. I always say that it would be about the same country if I'd never been born. That's not quite true, but it's very nearly true. History does not depend upon a single individual. But I will say this. There was one person who needed to be the commander-in-chief. That was George Washington. There was one person who needed to be the sort of legal historian and postulator. That's John Adams. If you wanted to choose the right person to write the Declaration of Independence, it was a good thing that they chose me, because I am a dreamer. I'm an idealist. I have confidence in the human project. I believe that America is an aspirational experiment, and I placed in the Declaration of Independence the hopes of humankind in a way. When I was asked about it, I said this was no time for original thinking. I was just expressing the common sense of the subject, of course, but I wanted to present it in a language so firm and so clear and so compelling that it would command assent. And I think that's the strength of the Declaration of Independence. It's idealism, it's aspirationalism, it's firmness, and prose, really good prose. And John Adams said of me, he said, Mr. Jefferson has a peculiar felicity for expression. And so that's why I got the assignment. And I have to say, it's one of my 3 proudest achievements.
And I think you're right and you're wrong in that it wouldn't have been any different if you hadn't been born, because I think it was the coming together of those individuals at that time, at that moment, and the right mix of people. We see throughout history where having the right people around the table, the right people in the room, the right people rising to the occasion makes all the difference in the world, and truly did in your case. And I think the beauty, too, of your entire experience of public service is we have so many things to reference that help us determine your view. In addition to the Declaration itself, speeches that you made, statements that you made over the years. As we begin this program and look at the measuring stick of where we are as a nation in the American experiment here 250 years later, I think we need to agree upon 4 or 5 measuring sticks to be able to determine exactly what would we consider a success, because according to some, it's been a tremendous success. According to others, somehow we've lost our way as a nation and we don't have the vision of the founding fathers. We're either not free enough or we're too free in some areas. There are issues that go back to originality of the Constitution, which came along a few years later. And so could you help us as we go through this process determine what the degrees of measurement should be to look at how we're doing as a nation?
I will. Let me say one more thing about the myth of the indispensable man. I will say this. If I hadn't been born, the people of Virginia would have to go to that deplorable college of William and Mary. If we didn't know that it was a college, the buildings look like a brick kiln. It's a malarial climate. Thank goodness I had the authority in my retirement to create the University of Virginia at Charlottesville in a central place. Imagine if you Virginians were stuck with William and Mary.
Oh, all those Wahoos are cheering for you, but William and Mary is seething at this moment. You know that.
Well, try harder. I tried to reform it as governor. I worked hard to reform it. It didn't want to be reformed. And so I said, well, I've always thought that we should have a central university. I happen to live near the center of Virginia. Charlottesville would be a good place to put this. Had a hard time convincing the House of Delegates to do this. They found it a little whimsical and a little expensive, especially when I tried to bring all sorts of classical motifs and build a replica of the of the pantheon as the centerpiece of the academical village and so on. But my point is that was an achievement that I think depended upon me. I might also say that the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty is maybe my greatest achievement. That was 1786. And I think you're blessed, even now, in this late state of the American experiment, you are blessed by having a wall of separation between church and state. But having said that, if you propose the categories, I will try to assess what I take to be your progress over a quarter of a millennium.
Well, I'll tell you, in preparation for our conversation today, I did a little bit of study on some of the things that you talked about over the years in speeches and letters and in the Declaration of Independence itself. And I think I have 5 areas that would be a good starting point. Questions to determine whether we are where we need to be with the American experience. The first question, does the country as it exists today preserve liberty? The second question, does it promote human happiness, the pursuit of happiness that is such a central part of the Declaration and the elements of our Constitution? Does it serve as a model for the world? Are we that shining light of the American experiment around the globe as we were with the revolution that existed 250 years ago? Does it depend on education and civic virtue to focus, to endure? Are we a nation of education and laws? Are we a nation of thought and debate? Or are we a nation that devolves into bullying and violence to solve our issues? And then finally, do we prove with the United States of America in 2025, 2026, that self-governance can work? And so those are the areas I would propose based on some of the things you said. Now, certainly you may have a different yardstick that would be a better measurement, but within those 5 areas, do you believe we can value where we are today?
Well, let me say this. In my own time, I would have put at the top, are we still an agrarian people? In my time, 97% of the American people were farmers. I think that's about the right percentage. I think farmers are the freest people, the most independent people, the chosen people of God, as I put it in my only book, Notes on Virginia. So I would place that pretty high. And this time, you are not.
So I think that's a complicated piece. Some of the things that were viewed as most important in 1776, are they truly what's important for the success and the level of the United States in the 2020s?
Other than that, I like your taxonomy of questions to measure the success of the United States, and I'll be happy to try to tell you how I thought about them in my time, and very carefully to try to assess what I see in your time on these questions.
We are having a wonderful conversation with the 3rd President of the United States, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. We're taking a break right now, but when we return, we're going to go through these different topics of liberty, happiness, education, debate, and talk about where we are as a nation and how we measure up. You're listening to America. Welcome back to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton, your guest host today, coming to you from Radford, Virginia. And joining me is the 3rd President of the United States, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. We are fortunate to have him here as we discuss where we are as a nation as we near the 250th birthday of the United States of America. Mr. President, before we took a break, we talked about 5 areas looking at liberty, happiness, serving as a model for the world, looking at education and civic virtue, and self-governance. Could you reflect on each of those areas and help us kind of look at where we are and where you thought we might be and where we could be or should be, beginning with the preservation of liberty?
And let me start by saying congratulations. You have survived for 250 years. I had no doubt of that. I had no doubt of that whatsoever. Now, whether you're still a republic is an interesting question. When I look at this, my biggest concern as someone from my time is your appalling national debt. You're asking about liberty. If you rack up enough national debt, at some point you enslave yourself because the interest payments on that debt begin to eat the entire budget. It means you can't do some things that you would really like to do. I was president of the United States between 1801 and 1809, and during those 2 terms, my main purpose was to reduce the size of the national debt as much as possible. Thanks to Alexander Hamilton and the war, we had an $80 million national debt, and I was able to retire 37% of it during my 2 terms by extraordinary fiscal responsibility. And it actually hamstrung my administration. There were things I couldn't do because we didn't have the money. But until you balance your budget, you are dooming your children and grandchildren to a very impoverished life. You're either going to have to pay it off or repudiate it, or it's going to eat the government of the United States. And at that point, liberty means nothing.
That's an interesting point to make. And there are deficit hawks from time to time in our era, although that seems to go away because, just as you mentioned, the difficult thing is which administration wants to take on the role of removing that debt. That's one of the big challenges. Beyond debt, how would you measure the preservation of liberty as you see it from your time into the 2020s?
I would say that you're the freest people who ever walked on the face of the earth, and more so in your time than in mine. We have to remember that we had slaves. I myself owned slaves. Women were not participators in the public arena. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold public office. Native Americans or Indians were called not taxed. They were foreign nations. A lingering class system that we had inherited from Great Britain. Although our middle class was the widest in human history, we still had some lingering echoes of that kind of feudalism, hierarchies of the old world. And so people were not free. People had substantially more freedom than anything that had come before. Revolutionarily more freedom than anything that had come before, with the possible exception for the elite in the Athens of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. But in your time, it really is the question of anything goes. People have a gigantic amount of mobility in your time, thanks to partly to technology. They have access to more information, more perspectives, more works of literature, philosophy, history, anthropology, religion, and law than any people who ever lived. That you are so wealthy that you have capacities to protect yourselves from the usual problems of life. I would say that you're breathtakingly free, that your liberty is at an all-time acme. However, it's not clear that you're using that liberty for the good. You know, the liberty can be misused for selfish purposes, for narcissism, oppression of others. It's not clear to me that with all the liberty that you have and all the access that you have in your time, that you really understand what liberty means. It doesn't, in my opinion, just mean anything goes. You have unlimited freedom, do what you please. Nobody's going to stop you. That would be a misuse of the concept of liberty. Liberty, once you get it, needs to be applied for the betterment of yourself, your family, your community, and humankind.
Along with liberty, one of the most famous portions of the Declaration of Independence is the statement, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think the pursuit of happiness is one that is good to discuss as a metric for how we are doing as a nation. Are we happy as a nation? Are we finding happiness within our daily lives as Americans?
I'm not a psychologist, and psychology didn't exist in my time. And I, of course, died in 1826, so I had better be careful about how wildly I comment here. But let me say that the United States enjoys prosperity unprecedented in human history, that people have ready discretionary money to purchase things that please them. But I think that maybe you're misunderstanding what I meant by the phrase pursuit of happiness. It wasn't original. I was borrowing it from John Locke and other writers of the Enlightenment. John Locke was one of my three heroes. He's the author of the second treatise on government, from which a great portion of the Declaration of Independence is drawn. And when he writes about the pursuit of happiness, he doesn't mean going to the beach and having a glass of ale. He means the pursuit of public happiness, that we are entitled by natural law to life, of course, to security, to liberty. We've begun to talk about that. And the pursuit of happiness is that each people, each generation has a right to formulate the American experiment in a way likely to produce the greatest sum of happiness for the greatest number of people. So happiness is not hedonism. I actually got into a little bit of a quarrel later in my life with one of my proteges, William Short, in some ways my favorite protege. And he wrote me a letter saying, Mr. Jefferson, I just wanted you to know, we hadn't seen each other for a while, that I regard myself as an Epicurean. And I knew what he meant. He was a pleasure seeker. And I wrote back a stern letter. I didn't write many stern letters. And I said, you're misreading Epicureanism. It's not about hedonism. It's not about self-indulgence. It's not about momentary joys and ecstasies. It's about a rational life in which you calculate how to be successful, how to be free, how to be responsible, how to be a good steward of the land, how to be a good father, grandfather, cousin, brother, etc. The pursuit of happiness is not to seek your own physical and mental pleasures. The pursuit of happiness is to create a polity that works for the maximum number of people. And so I think it's a felicitous phrase. I think the Declaration of Independence would be a lesser document if the phrase pursuit of happiness were not in it. But I think it has been misread to mean as long as I'm personally happy, that must be the purpose. And that's not it at all. We have very deep civic responsibilities.
Mr. President, as people work toward that civic community happiness, what did you see in your day that actually worked, that you thought would be the way things would move forward as the nation progressed over the decades and centuries?
I came before the phrase, the cliche of your time, that the trajectory of the universe is difficult but tends towards justice. But I believe that. I believe that in human progress, I believe that every generation after mine was going to get it better, get it right, improve the American experiment, amend the Constitution, tear it up when necessary, start over, that we were the most remarkable people who had ever walked on Earth, and we were going to leave the possibilities that our children and grandchildren and their children and grandchildren would be happier, would be more secure, would be more enlightened, would do the right thing on almost all occasions, and when there were setbacks, they would be self-correcting, and so on. And so that was really my faith in humankind. And now I know that if Hamilton were here, he would just scoff at this. Really? You believe in human perfectibility, Mr. Jefferson? So would John Adams. I mean, they were both people of a dark psychology about human nature. I'm not. I do get it that humans are capable of error, that we make mistakes, that there are a handful of people who are twisted for some reason and have to be watched or sequestered. But on the whole, I believe that humans are up to the business of living responsible and self-reliant lives, and I believe that they're up to the business of governing themselves. And so my optimism continues into your own day. I'm not certain that you can do this without understanding what's at stake. And I think that's one of my concerns about your time is that the people in pursuing material happiness or hedonism have forgotten the project, and the project only succeeds if the majority, including a large majority of the people, understand what liberty means, how you preserve it, what its pitfalls are, what challenges it might face. And I think until this sort of anticipates your question about education, but until you get serious about inculcating in your entire population an understanding of how fragile a republic is and how easily it can go wrong, then I'm not sure that you can maintain this thing over the long run.
Well, you brought up education and civic engagement. Can we talk about that a little bit and how you viewed and you would currently view America's ability to learn how to govern itself, learn how to participate in a representative republic / democracy, and the level of civics that you saw and that you would hope that we would have today?
I said, that's oft quoted in your time, if you expect to be a nation ignorant and free, you expect what never has been and never can be. I think you're actually testing that model in your time. As I understand it, civics is not much taught. Surveys show that the average American doesn't really even know the tripartite system of the federal government, doesn't know how a law is passed, what a veto entails and how it can be overridden, doesn't understand how a constitution is amended, doesn't understand the emoluments clause, the pardon clause, the impeachment clause, the war powers clauses, and so on. If you don't understand the social compact, now you don't have to be like a brilliant scholar of the Constitution, but if you don't basically understand why the model was adopted by the founding fathers in Philadelphia of three branches of the national government, each designed to check and balance the other two, and thus to maintain a kind of Newtonian even keel. If you don't understand that, then you won't be able to see where it has been misused and to right it at that time. And so, what flummoxes me as someone who lived in a time when there was almost no public education. I advocated public education in Virginia, never was able to get it done. It was happening in New England. And by the way, New England was outdistancing us because they were educating their children. And the town meetings in New England were sort of democracy per se at times, where everyone gets a chance to speak. Why do we have public education? In my view, we have public education for civics training. In other words, you're born with a right to freedom. You're born with a right to be an equal citizen. You're born with a right to govern yourself. That's all in natural law, I believe, sir. But you're not born with the skill to do that. You have to be trained. It has to be inculcated. It doesn't just happen. And so I think you've gotten to the point in your time where you don't really think about this anymore. And when you do think about education, you're thinking about things that are really interesting, biology or astronomy or calculus, all really important subjects, but they're not civics. Civics is what we need. And I think it shows in your time that the American people have a really detached view of their operating system and don't know when it's in trouble, when it's being eroded, and therefore turn away to private pleasures rather than to fixate on the hard and difficult business of self-government.
I would actually say in my thought that we tend to participate more in government as a team sport as opposed to actual civics and hoping to achieve a higher level where we actually have found truth or found some common path forward, that it's much more, do I win or lose? That does my team win? Does my party win? Does my side win? And looking for those things as opposed to an outcome that serves the greater good or serves the most people.
This only works, in my opinion, if the citizenry is relatively well-informed and well-educated. I don't think you qualify in that zone any longer. And it only works if people understand the majority rule inevitably involves compromises on both sides, and that if you split into tribes, the Federalists versus the Republicans, the Whigs versus the Democrats, and so on, if you tribalize the system in that way, you will not be able to govern yourself. There has to be a spirit of acquiescence and coordination and reconciliation at the center. And I wrote about this in my first inaugural address. Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We've called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. And I do believe that's true. I think that we share more than we disagree about. We all wanted a Federalist government to the point we could protect ourselves and have a vibrant economy and have a foreign policy that worked, and a taxation system that could really create the engine of prosperity. But we were all Republicans in that we wanted the least government that could do the job. We wanted to have a maximum of individual freedom. We believed that states were more competent than the federal government in many respects. And so we were all Federalists. We were all Republicans.
Well, and with all of that having been said, does the United States of America today prove that self-government can work?
Yes, you're still at it. You still have elections. Your Congress is paralyzed. If John Adams were here, maybe you should talk with him, because he would say, once the separation of powers doctrine fails, things are not going to go well. So the idea is, this is Civics 101. I don't suppose I need to really repeat this, but the president is really an implementer of the will of Congress. Congress has two branches, the House, which is close to the people, and the Senate, which is at a little remove. They have to agree on every piece of legislation. Then it goes to the president. The president can veto it if he thinks that it's bad policy or that it's not in keeping with the Constitution. If Congress feels that the president is wrong or evil or misguided, they can override the veto and make it law. Meanwhile, the judicial system, the Supreme Court, sits on the side as a kind of careful referee and weighs in about what it believes is constitutional and what isn't. This only works when those three branches are in a dynamic tension, and each one is a little edgy about the others and protective of its own sovereignties and its providence. When each branch protects its own purview, its own portfolio, and when it sees something going wrong in one of the other two branches, it gets involved and checks it. And when all three branches appear to be kind of melded into one political tribe, as I think is the case in your time, and Congress clearly abdicates its responsibility as the primary legislative body and the embodiment of the will of the people, nothing good can come of this, that this only works. I mean, we know what tyranny looks like. We've seen it. King George III, Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI. We've seen it through history. Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte. We know what tyranny looks like. The only way to avoid it is to have a system in which power can't accumulate in any one individual or any one branch of the government. And when that fails, tyrannical activities are almost certain to begin. Because here's the thing, we can't trust people with power. I trust anyone until they have power. And when they have power, we need to have a straitjacket or a limitation on their capacity to do things that are not in keeping with the success of the entire civilization. This is an iron law of history. There is no antidote to this. If you're looking for a benevolent dictator, keep looking. There have been better and worse, but you cannot have a republic unless there is dynamic tension, creative tension, and sometimes real disputes between the coordinating branches of the national government. And I will add, this is my contribution, the state should also be challenging the national government. So there's a fourth check, too.
Mr. President, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion. We need to take a quick break, and we will return. When we come back to Listening to America, we will visit with humanities scholar Clay Jenkinson. Welcome back to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton, your co-host for this week, and joining me now is Clay Jenkinson. Clay, how are you, my friend?
My friend David Horton, it's been a while, and I'm so glad to see you. We're on a Zoom call here, so I can actually see you. You have, I think, a Superman t-shirt on. My goodness, I knew you were great. I had no idea you were that great.
I have secrets just like all.
Whenever we talk, we get onto some very serious subjects. And one of the things I like about your guest hosting is that you keep Jefferson at the center of it. And some of our listeners really want more Jefferson. And so I think we should get together more often for that. And I think this is especially the case now that we're approaching the 250th birthday of the country. So if Jefferson really could just kind of parachute down into our world, what would he think? Well, he'd be buying gadgets, of course, computers, cell phones, GPS units. Jefferson would be just thrilled with the tools we have. Or how about the internet? But you probably have free access to 600,000 or 700,000 books on your smartphone. Yep. You have access to much of what has been thought and said. When I'm reading a book now that has a lot of questions about art, and now I just routinely look up those paintings. I can just stop. I can have a couple of computers going and a phone and maybe an iPad. And if someone says, well, Salvador Dali did an interesting painting on this subject, 25 years ago, you had to sort of shrug, depending on the library. Maybe they have a book of all of Dali's art. But today, bang, 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 bang. And with AI, we need to get back to AI. I'm afraid to say, my friend, I've become sort of addicted to Chat GPT cartoons and images, but we'll come back to that. But AI is going to be an accelerator of unprecedented nature to all that we're talking about here. And so we're living in a really extraordinary time. And I think one reason, you're talking about America at 250, and we will be doing that more as we approach July 4th, 2026. One reason I think that we're so discontented, disillusioned, frustrated, angry, filled with rage, filled with mutual disrespect is because the pace of technological change has been so breathtaking. I mean, just unbelievable. I mean, remember the first time you saw the internet? Remember the first time you had a cell phone? Remember the first time you had a cell phone that connected to the internet? Or the first time you could use a camera in a phone to send pictures to your loved ones? I mean, things we just take for granted and a 10-year-old just assumes it's always been the case. Those things are many of them are products of the last 20 years. And if you add to that the social revolution, the LGBTQ world, transgender world, minority studies, the shattering of the literary canon, the vulgarization of American life, you add all those things up and they create a dynamism that's going to make a lot of people very, 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 very uneasy. And I think that's part of why there's so much rage and disappointment. And when you look at the metrics, my friend, literacy, we're like number 21 now. Child mortality, we've slipped. Longevity, we've slipped compared to our European allies. A lot is not going well in America. And I'll just say this, obviously America is still an extraordinary thing, especially for the haves, for the privileged. But when you kind of step back and think of 2026, how well are we doing? I don't think that any thoughtful person really trying to survey it can say we're thriving. We're bumbling along.
So I have a slightly different view than that. I don't disagree that we perceive that, but I think there is money to be made for discontent. Contentment is rarely profitable. And because we live in a world where everything is about the next great, whatever you can get, the next great opportunity, we tend to focus on what's wrong, what's missing, what do we need to fill to be happier. And most people are guilty of that. And I think that's a problem in our society. I think that's a fundamental flaw of capitalism because contentment and capitalism struggle to coexist. And I think that's a huge part of this issue, that people have gotten so sophisticated at tailoring messaging and cultivating that discontent that we live in this perpetual state of unhappiness that is relatively artificial. By any metric, if you look at most people's lives compared to 50 or 100 years ago, typically they are better. There are some things that are not as good. And, in the mid 20th century, there was a year-to-year progression where it seemed like the working family did a little better every year. And with inflation and some of the other trials and tribulations, it doesn't feel that way today. Although I marvel at the little things. When I am eating a tomato and an orange in February in Virginia, in the mountains of Virginia, I think 100 years ago, that was a miracle to the people that lived where I live.
It was when I was growing up. We ate our fruits in season or not at all.
Right. And so I think the biggest challenge we face as a nation is we overlook the things that are working. We view compromise as failure. We view the daily life without it being extraordinarily bountiful beyond our imagination as somehow being a failure. The luxury, which I'd like to get to, that Mr. Jefferson had mentioned, is there in most people's lives compared to 30 and 50 and 70 years ago. But the measuring sticks that we use, the way we think about it is somehow skewed. And I think there's money to be made and there's power to be gained by doing those things. If we are a happy people and everything feels good, you don't feel compelled to tune into the news, to read the stories, to follow information, that there's money to be made. That's a little bit cynical, but honestly, it's cynical in that we should be feeling better than we do. We should be seeking compromise more often and feeling good about that compromise, as opposed to the level of tribalism that Mr. Jefferson discussed and how we only view things happily when it is through the political lens that we're most comfortable with. That when our leaders find a path together where everybody lost a little and everybody won a little, but they compromised and found a way forward, somehow that's wrong. And I think that's been the big problem in recent years and over the last probably 40 years, really since the Reagan Revolution.
I think that a lot of the discontentment in the country is about the unequal distribution of the fruits of life, money, access, and so on. So Jefferson wasn't really a capitalist. He wasn't an anti-capitalist, but he understood that capitalism abstracts value from human situations in a way that can be really corrosive. And so he wanted a barter economy if possible. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But he didn't want us to move into sort of Hamilton's world of centralized finance and deficit spending. And, if Jefferson himself was a terrible money manager for himself, so he'd probably have credit card debt through the roof today. But I think the American people look around and see those who are the winners. For example, a football player in North Carolina or Kansas City who's making $45 million per year, and I may be making $61,000 and have 3 children, and I'm struggling just to keep up, to get gas in the car, to groceries on the table, clothes on my children, summer camps or whatever. I think when people see that, they lose faith in the American experiment. And I think that Jefferson wrote letters about this in France. He wrote to Mr. Madison and said, basically, at some point, we're going to have to redistribute property in this country, because if we don't, it'll accumulate in the hands of the few. When that happens, it creates widespread discontentments and class envies and so on. And it usually leads at some point to a trigger, which creates the French Revolution. And so he wanted to have a geometrically graduated income tax. He believed in land reform under certain circumstances. I think what's happened is now we have, when I was growing up, the word billionaire didn't exist. There were a handful of millionaires in my own North Dakota. Now everyone's basically a millionaire, and if you add up their equity, and now it's billionaire, and billionaire doesn't even cover it. Now we have super billionaires. And I think when the American people see that, 2 things happen. First of all, they're filled with envy. Why don't I have a private plane? And instead of addressing the issue of runaway capitalism or saying maybe I'm just not that talented or haven't worked that hard, then they want to blame somebody. And along comes a demagogue, and I'll just say Rush Limbaugh is a perfect example. He says, well, David Horton, if you're not wealthy, it's because of the feminazis. If you're not wealthy, it's because of the environmentalists. If you're not wealthy, it's because of the socialists. And so this idea that everyone wishes that they won the lottery, they can't understand why they're not doing as well as those who are really doing well. And then they're told by demagogues that there's a reason for it. But those demagogues never say it only works if we even it out in some ways. And so who's done that? Lincoln said that property is overrated. Theodore Roosevelt believed that unless you chasten runaway capitalism, you will lead to a Bolshevik revolution. FDR had the same view. That was true in the Great Society. And so there are individuals in our political history who've understood that capitalism must be checked and pretty carefully channelized in order for it to work. And we've basically given up. I mean, not only in the Citizens United case that allows entities to spend $1 million gazillion on a political candidacy without even having to register it. I'm a humanities scholar. I'm not worth $40 million a year, but I'm not sure that a person who bounces a ball is worth $40 million a year either. And then I have to wonder, well, why am I a modest member of the middle class when I spend my life trying to understand our history and its possibilities and its paradoxes, and somebody else, and believe me, I admire them, is a great ball player, and that person is earning 1,000 times what a plumber is earning, or a garbage man, or a landscape gardener. That's unsustainable. Jefferson understood that that's unsustainable, and we won't address it in America. And one reason we won't address it is everyone thinks, well, maybe I'll win the lottery, and then I won't want anyone taking my money away. So that's a real problem, I think. I think that our discontentment comes, and there's a second major one. And so what I'm saying is not quite Jefferson, David, because I believe that the issue of America is a spiritual issue. I think we are spiritually diseased. There's a radical dis-ease. I think that the people are turning away because they find the civic world so bewildering and so frustrating. And this is only going to get worse. And I think we have to address it. And I don't know what you would say, but if I were asked, if someone said, all right, Archimedes, you say, give me a place to put my lever and I will move the world, I would start with national service. I think national service would be the most likely to turn this country around of anything that we could possibly do. What's amazing, David, is that both parties talk about it all the time and it never happens. But if we did it, I think we could renew. But I don't think the average 18 or 19-year-old has any sense of stake in America. They just want stuff.
I think in this nation and as a human nature, sometimes we have to flirt with disaster and hope it doesn't kill us before we can learn and recalibrate and move in a new direction. It's kind of where I feel like we are right now. And I'm hoping that some of the things will start to hit home. There have been a few little things that have happened over the last few months as the big, beautiful bill got passed, and some of the things are starting to become realities, that pockets of people who typically would have been big supporters of President Trump and some of the others are starting to say, whoa, wait just a minute, and maybe waking up to some of that information. I think the biggest challenge is, do we have enough time to do it? Are we able to flirt with disaster without actually having a disaster? And can we regain those elements that have made our nation the envy of the world in the past?
So, we haven't really mentioned Donald Trump in this, and I don't like to. I don't want to get stuck there. I think that he's a symptom rather than the cause in large part, and that it's a mistake to locate all of our angst in him or all of our hopes in him if you're a MAGA Republican. But I will say that leadership is a really important thing, and great leaders help the country move to fulfill its ideals. And great leaders know that you can't take a third of the country or half the country there. You have to take the whole country, and therefore you have to represent them, and you have to respect them, and you have to listen to them, and you have to compromise with them. And so we haven't had that kind of leadership for a while. And I think the Democrats make this mistake over and over again. They think the country is more progressive than it is, and they exactly assume too much and push too far. I remember when Barack Obama was elected, most of us were thrilled, and we thought, oh, we're moving into a post-racial time in America. Boy, were we wrong. That touched off an ugly, visceral, racist reaction by millions of people. Whatever they said their reasons, it was basically deep discomfort with an African American as the president of the United States. And look what's happened. Donald Trump rose to power as a birther, arguing more than any other American that Barack Obama was not an American citizen, that he was some sort of an Islamic infiltrator. Most of Trump's first term was an attempt to undo what he took to be the achievements or the misachievements of the Obama administration. I think that if we had waited a little longer, and I hate to say that because it's well overdue. I mean, obviously, Barack Obama was an extraordinary human being who became the president of the United States, one of the greats in many respects. But I don't think the country was quite ready. And look what happens when you push too hard, too fast. The reaction has been breathtaking. And the forces of progressivism have not been able to regroup. They haven't been able to redefine themselves, and they fail. And this is what really bothers me, David. They fail to understand that most of the country is substantially more conservative than they think.
Yes.
Until they get that, and Bill Clinton at least understood this better than most Democrats. But until they figure that out, they're going to be a party in minority and in the margins.
I agree very much with some of the things that you were just saying, and I think we need to explore that further in a future edition of this program. This has been a wonderful and enlightening conversation and a fantastic edition of Listening to America.
It pains me, my friend. I know we have to go, but I think if Jefferson appeared, he'd say, until you settle the issue of your national debt, you cannot do great things because the interest is now eating most of the discretionary funds that are not Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. And that means you basically put a straitjacket on yourselves by what? The richest country in the history of the world refuses to pay its bills. That's gonna turn out to really hurt us in his eyes.
I agree. I think it's challenging. And yet we're in a situation where putting those kind of headwinds on the economy, when we do reduce the debt, when we make those fiscal changes, has its own set of challenges that come along with it, just like Mr. Jefferson saw during his time. Even during that time, he couldn't resist purchasing the Louisiana Purchase, growing the size of our nation and moving us forward. I think it's all difficult, but it's all a process. And
this could be these are issues that can be solved if we only had the will to solve them. Just give you one quick example. I know we have to stop. If you said to every department of the United States government, you must reduce your budget by 10% next year, then the pain is spread around. We know there's 10% in every branch of government, in every agency, in every entity. It's a start. If you just start, it doesn't have to solve the problem tomorrow, but there has to be some sense in which we're all going to have to tighten our belts or pay more taxes or reduce our spending if we really want to solve this problem. And it can be solved. But man, if you say, let's reduce the budget of the National Institute for Health, the Democrats go berserk. If you say, let's reduce the budget for the CIA or the Defense Department, the Republicans go berserk. And so we can't do it.
Clay, thank you so much. It is always a pleasure talking with you.
Mine too. Thank you. I so appreciate you.
Friends, thank you so much for joining us for another fascinating edition of Listening to America.